Hello and welcome again to CTRL+F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Centers podcast. This season, we are bringing you a series of sessions from one of the nation's leading cyber events, the National Cyber Innovation Forum. My name is Andrew McClure, the president of the National Cyber Innovation Forum, and in this episode, we dive into part one of a conversation with the head of corporate and government affairs at Snowflake, Matthew Rose, the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Treasury, Sam Korkos, the Chief Economist at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Anup Malani, and the CTO in the Vice President's Task Force to Eliminate Fraud, Andrew McCarthy. Stay tuned for a conversation about how federal leaders are leveraging data, technology, and interagency collaboration to combat fraud across healthcare, tax and payment services, and public entitlement benefits. Drawing on perspectives from the CMS, the White House Task Force to Eliminate Fraud, and the Department of the Treasury, this panel will explore how emerging technologies and operational innovation are improving program integrity, reducing improper payments, and safeguarding taxpayer resources while strengthening confidence in essential public services.
Well, everybody, thank you. We've had a fun afternoon today, and up next is our last and final panel before we head out to our reception, which I hope you all can stay for. But this one is one that I'm looking forward to, our session titled Combating Fraud, A View from the Frontlines. So we have Andrew McCarthy, Sam Korkos, Anup Malani, and Matt Rose. So please welcome. Andrew McCarthy is the Chief Technology Officer for the White House's Task Force to Eliminate Fraud. The task force was created in March 2026 on behalf of the President to coordinate and accelerate comprehensive national strategy to stop fraud, waste, and abuse with federal benefit programs. Sam Korkos. Sam is the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Treasury, and before that was the CEO of Levels. And Anup Malani is the Chief Economist over at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and he's on leave as the Lee and Brenna Freeman Professor at the University of Chicago. So this panel is moderated by Matthew Rose. Matt, please take it from here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. I definitely appreciate it. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Rose. I'm with Snowflake, and I get the honor of leading the panel and what I think is going to be the most consequential session of the day here as we wrap up just an amazing group of folks here this afternoon. To frame it with the leadership here, I'm going to frame the problem space and the solution space for everyone. Fraud in federal programs is not just an abstraction that we're dealing with. It represents hundreds of billions of dollars diverted from Americans who depend on these programs. And just over the past months, we've seen extraordinary plans of action, of which many of the leaders on stage are leading, and many others. An executive order establishing the task force to eliminate fraud, a nationwide moratorium on hospice and home enrollments, $1.4 billion in payments halted by suspected bad actors. The pace of work is unlike anything I've seen coming from government over 2 decades, and it's really moving out quickly. Andrew introduced the 3 leaders we have on stage or on the front lines of the fight. I'll just quickly highlight what we have up here as technologists and those who are actually leading the efforts to fight fraud across the United States. So with that, and just to highlight some opening remarks, Andrew, given that the task force is just a few months old now, about 2 months old, and coordinating across the entire federal enterprise, the mission space, I'd like for you and offer a moment for you to frame the conversation for everyone here. What would you like this audience to know, many of which are policymakers or officials who interact with programs on a daily basis? What would you like them to understand?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt. I wish we were in a meeting about such an existential crisis. I wish this was a lighter topic, so next time you have me back, let's have something a little lighter. But no, it really is, and if we, talk about the heft or the scale that's involved in what the task force and these agencies are dealing with, this truly is a make-or-break moment for our budget, for where our taxes go, for accountability within government. So we're going to talk about a variety of technology and policy issues today. But I want to say that the task force and the agency leadership is moving fast on this issue. Just today we had some big news coming out of Minnesota, and you should expect to hear big news every week moving forward.
So Andrew, thank you. Let's start the conversation today with big picture. We've seen estimates of improper payments and outright fraud across federal programs, figures around hundreds of billions. One of the things you've noted is that state-administered federal programs represent some of the largest pools. Entire blocks of states is where the problem is. So if I can, I'll ask you directly, and I'll try my best to liven it up, but it is an earnest conversation. What is the mission of the task force to eliminate fraud, and how is technology specifically reshaping the government's efforts in this regard?
Sure. So really the mission is twofold. First, protecting the taxpayers' investment in these agencies. They expect at least a return on their investment every time we go to pay our taxes. And then the second is obviously, probably more important than that, is protecting the most vulnerable, the participants in these programs. So whether it's education, housing, if you need food assistance, or any of these programs that the EO covers, it's really just the two-pronged approach, protecting the taxpayers' investment to protecting the most vulnerable. So how technology plays a role in that, the executive order that was created surrounding the task force is really pretty clear. It starts with a baseline understanding of good data governance and an emphasis on data federalization, which is a forcing mechanism for a lot of these agencies, separate from the fraud issue, regarding cleaning up your data, making sure that this is understandable and usable across the board, including subcomponents within agencies. But as it pertains to fraud and the task force, making sure that this data is usable across agencies, so on an interagency level, making sure that there are MOUs and data sharing agreements in place so that we have the basic foundation of data governance in play. The EO then goes on to detail mechanisms to be included in the tax acts within all of these agencies. First is an identity and eligibility verification mechanism on the front end of applications. So whether you're an entity or an individual and you go to apply for benefits with the U.S. government, making sure that that is a legit entity or individual. Moving on from there, moving sort of into the system in each agency, enhanced risk engines. So making sure that we're taking harder looks at applicants from the data perspective, not manually subject matter experts or analysts going through and having to read these by hand per se, that we're using algorithms to improve fraud detection and possible fraud detection in that process. And then just like any Fortune 100 bank would do before the payments go out the door, certifying that that individual or entity that's getting a payment is who they said they were on the front end. And then finally, I'll just say, leaving with these agencies with an omnipresent, AI-driven audit mechanism so that they can take a look at a dashboard and see potential fraud spikes coming in the door of their agencies.
Andrew, I appreciate you kind of laying it down at every level, and there's some items I'd like to come back to in a bit. But before we do, Anoop, so glad the CMS is here, so glad you're part of the conversation. You and your team, the entire team, administers one of the largest programs in that specific universe in the entire globe. Dr. Oz has made it a central management priority to combat fraud, framing it as essential to maintain the future of Medicare and Medicaid. It means something, I think, to everyone in this room. It means something near and dear to my heart. I have a mother that relies on these programs. There's citing estimates that fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal health care and social service programs exceeds $100 billion a year. Your job within CMS as the chief economist, I would love for you to walk through what kind of fraud you're seeing, why this is so commonplace, and specifically where does CMS think the largest vulnerabilities are that exist?
Yeah, so first, thank you very much for having me. And you're right, we like to think of ourselves as the largest payer in the country, but also amongst the largest payers in the world. It's a $1.7 trillion program each year. And you are exactly right to highlight that there's been a large expansion in the amount of fraud that we see. Now we think that fraud ranges somewhere between 3 to 10% of our spending. So we are talking over $100 billion worth of fraud, perhaps several $100 billion of fraud. One of the things that we want to highlight is that this wasn't always the case. This is a change that we've seen over the last decade, especially during the COVID era. We had a substantial number of changes that made it difficult, or at least opened the opportunity for fraud, which is we had big expansion in enrollment, we had prohibitions on disenrollment, those sorts of activities, plus the lack of filtering as money went out the door, allowed for a substantial expansion. And we are seeing the fruits of that now. Fortunately, we're taking some actions to pull that back. The most important, let's talk about some of the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities, I think, it's helpful to divide it up into vulnerabilities on the side of the provider, vulnerabilities on the sides of the payments, and the actual treatments being done, and the third is thinking about the actual individuals who are enrolled. And if we use those three categories, we can see the changes. There's a large increase in number of providers, whether it's hospices or other programs, DME, durable medical equipment, massive expansion in spending on that, so that's a big source of vulnerability. A second source of vulnerability, and a lot of that you've heard on the news, a second source of vulnerability is growth in certain types of payments for services, massive growth. So for example, skin substitutes grew from $250 million a year to $10 billion a year from 2019 to 2024, massive expansion, so we have a lot of examples of that. And the last thing is, there was a good reason to have an expansion of coverage during COVID, but we maybe were a little bit too lax, and now we're seeing a lot of duplicative enrollment. So about 1.2 million people, I think, are enrolled in multiple states' Medicaid programs, so they're in multiple states, and then 1.6 million people are enrolled both in exchanges and Medicaid, so they're getting duplicative coverage. So it's these sorts of things that are it's that change that generated vulnerability, and this is the magnitude of the result.
Yeah, I think that's right, and the approach and the vulnerabilities you highlighted. I'm going to focus specifically on some of the news from last week that came out of CMS. Just last week, as I mentioned, CMS announced a 6-month nationwide moratorium on new hospice and home health agency enrollments. The task force halted $1.4 billion in payments of suspected fraudulent providers related. CMS, as a result, announced internally a fraud war room inside the agency to identify suspicious bill paying patterns and rapidly suspend payments there within. It's also been reported that CMS has stopped payments to more than 400 hospice providers in Los Angeles, California, amid some of the concerns and widespread abuse potentially. If you can, tell us a bit about the task force internally, the fraud war room, and why are you all focusing specifically on that area?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to point out, it's really hard to underestimate the magnitude of the fraud. You said 400, it's actually 800 hospice providers, and the suspensions that we're seeing are broader than just hospice. There's a whole range of services that are high risk, where we think they're providers that are high risk of committing fraud, and those are unsurprisingly areas where it's hard to verify that services are provided. So think on the Medicaid side, you're talking about things like emergency medical transport, behavioral therapy, sometimes personal care. On the Medicare side, you're seeing DME, durable medical equipment, and you're seeing home and community-based care. These are places where you're away from institutions, so fraud's a little bit easier. And what we have to do is think about those high-risk areas and look for providers that pose the risk of fraud. Now, let's turn to the fraud, the war room, as we like to call it. It's the Fraud Defense Operations Center, started in May of 2025, and really it's a paradigm shift. So historically, the way we've gone after fraud is what we now call pay and chase, which is money goes out the door, it's already in the hands of the provider, we figure out ex post, hey, this was probably fraud, then we go and begin a litigation process to retrieve that money. That is a difficult process, both because it takes a lot of time, and we have limited amount of administrative capacity to pursue all these things, but more importantly, we get back only a fraction of the money, and it's later. So we're losing out on value along the way. Now we're using a more proactive technique that we called stop and caught or stop and catch, which is before the money goes out the door, we stop the payments, and then we look to see if there's rationale for it. And the tip of the spear on that is the fraud war room, the fraud defense operations center, and that sits on top of a fraud profession system, which is a large database that's evaluating about 4 to 5 million claims per day, Medicare claims per day, just to see if there's indicia for fraud, spikes in certain types of treatments, especially when you see the spike over a period of time as compared to other places. Those are the indicators or the signals that we look for, and then based on that, we've gone after several $1 billion of payments already.
Yeah, it's hard to get a full size and scale of what we're talking about, and to your point, it's pretty broad. Sam, I'm going to move over to you. Treasury sits at the center of federal payments, over 5 billion disbursements a year. You came in as a technologist and really focused on modernization, so I want to kind of tie it into that. So as you're modernizing Treasury systems, whether it's improving visibility, integrity, or fraud prevention, what specifically and how could agencies do better to authenticate whether it's the recipients or validate the payments are legitimate?
Yeah, so Treasury...
There we go. At Treasury, we have the Do Not Pay system. It's one of the authorities that we have. We process about $6 trillion a year in payments. Pretty much all the money goes through Treasury, finally make it out the door. So we're in a unique position to be able to check all these things that folks are talking about to make sure that it's going to the right people. One of my biggest surprises was this comes from legislation back in 2012, and functionally had not really been in existence up until about 3 months ago. I think 1 year ago, the Do Not Pay system for payment verification scanned 2% of the $6 trillion going out the door and only checked whether someone was dead or not. We're now up to 98% for Death Master File, and we're pulling in new data assets every few weeks. I think when it comes to technology, the biggest learning for me was just the gap between policy and implementation was much larger than I anticipated. There's often news stories about things that are done. We passed this law, we had this policy, but that doesn't actually mean that it exists in reality.
So you brought up the Do Not Pay initiative, the system. It's been credited with saving over $11 billion, specifically through AI screening. And recently, OMB directed all agencies last year address the data gap specifically into that system. So less on the challenges, less on the scale, maybe if we will make it a little more optimistic, what are the opportunities that exist to use things like the data here within Treasury or elsewhere to support the overall anti-fraud strategy? And then, as you said, as a CIO, I'm seeing everything across. How is the department or others using tech and data to help reduce this anti-fraud initiative?
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous potential for it. I mean, we have a line of sight on maybe $500 billion in fraud. A lot of that's one-time payments from the COVID era, but it's really not that hard to find if you look for it. It's just one of there are a lot of things that people probably assume are being checked regularly that really are not, but we're now finally integrating those data sources to check things that I think everyone would think is pretty normal to check for. And so we're in a unique nexus because we are ultimately the choke point before the money goes out the door. So as Amit mentioned, instead of paying chase, we are in the position to stop the money and then figure out what to do with it after.
Yeah, that's helpful. So Andrew, we had some time to speak in the green room, and I think, what's said in the green room stays in the green room, but I shared some of my personal experience working in government and dealing with some of the interagency challenges. Now that you're serving in this role and you've got this broad mandate, and so what you highlighted in the opening was it's really an interagency coordination challenge, especially on the data side. The task force sits above any individual agency or department, so you get an opportunity to sit on the landscape and see how things are going. So with that, How are they going? Are you getting the data? Are you seeing the insights? How is cooperation occurring?
Yes, so I've worked within the Beltway for about 10 years. I was in the private sector before that. And I just have to say, in terms of coordination, I've never seen things work this smoothly. It's a pretty diverse array of agencies, career civil servants, politically appointed cabinet members, and everyone's operating in lockstep. So that is sort of one of the silver linings here. And I think part of that is that understanding the gravity of the situation, all of those parties understand that if we don't get this done now, it's probably not going to be attempted again. So there's that. And then if you go to the tactical side of it, I do have to credit Sam and the contingent of CIOs within the agencies listed in the executive order that we oversee. They've been wildly helpful in coming forward and saying, this is what we're working with internally in our components. This is how we think that, whether it's through data federalization methodology or whether it's through data sharing agreements, MOUs, how we're going to move forward with interagency coordination and information sharing. So there's that. And then probably the most exciting thing is, once we sort of hopefully have the federal side of this under control, pivoting to the states here in the next few months to share best practices, encourage data sharing both ways, and taking a look at their technical architecture, which unfortunately, believe it or not, in some cases is worse than some of our federal agencies. So that'll be exciting.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks to Hannah Haynes, Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI CTC team in helping us produce today's episode. Be on the lookout every Monday and Wednesday for more sessions from the National Cyber Innovation Forum. If you like what you heard, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks again.